myself, I'm the Assistant Dean for Research for the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. So I'm actually coming in on behalf of also the Vice Dean of Research for the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Professor Elaine Ho. And basically to just open the session and to welcome everybody to today's book launch. Okay. So a little bit about a little bit about the book launch and what is it all about before I pass on the mic to our chair for today's session. Primarily, the book launch is an ongoing series by the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences Research Division. And today's book launch is surprisingly very, very well attended. Usually we have quite a good hearty attendance. But today, even Rachel kind of mentioned that we have actually kind of under-prepared the beverages, and for that I will send the apologies on behalf of the organizing committee, okay, because it's a very good attendance, so I hope there will be quite a bit of good hearty discussion, a very strong debate and discussion following the discussion, okay. So, that said, I got reminded, we first and foremost will, if you can just join me to put our hands together to say thank you to the organizing committee, which is practically Rachel, Andrew, and also Yong Chuan. So it's actually a single lady with a team show that has been pulling off all the book launches, even at this very special place called the Port in the National Library. We know it's not easy to come by. I mean, we have a NLB Board of Director person here, so you know that this is not an easy place to come by. So thank you, Rachel, for putting on this, for organizing this talk so all of us can get together and enjoy the book launch. Okay, a little bit about the Singapore Research Nexus, which is not particularly an organization or institution by itself. It's actually an initiative by the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences Research Division. So in 2011, the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences realizes that there's a lot of faculty members, research work, scholarly work. It's not just scholarly and research work, but it also goes beyond research to include arts, humanities, and even scholarly work, and even music recordings and video recordings. There's a whole lot of literature and collections on specifically the Southeast Asian region that's being done in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. So what happens is the Singapore Research Nexus was developed, and in it serves to actually serve as a collection for resources for everyone who is interested on research done by the faculty in Arts and Social Sciences NUS. Research pertaining to the Southeast Asian region, but more specifically also research relating to Singapore in one way or another. Okay, so without further ado, I'll just go on to my next sharing about what is happening next in this series of book launch. So not to overshadow a very exciting talk, I'll just highlight the next few activities that's actually coming up with this Singapore Research Nexus series. So, if you can put in your calendar, can we have the previous slide, please? The other slide? Yes. So, if you can put in your calendar before you leave, you know how book talks are. You all got carried away, and we got very into heated discussion, and then the moment the launch finishes, or the talk finishes, everybody is engaging everybody in small little talks. So, we might actually miss this very important information. So, on Friday, 14 October, can I have the slides again? I wish I can memorize all these things. Okay, on the Friday, 14 October, there's an, so that is the FASS Distinguished Lecture Series, okay? So please take note of that on the 14th October, and then there will also be another book launch happening on Saturday, on the 26th of November, again at the Port. Okay, forget about that. Okay, just take note, there is our Facebook page, and there's our website, and I know even if I were to tell you, you all would tend to forget, but just go into our website, our Facebook page, either in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences website or the Singapore Research Nexus website, okay, to find out all the other events that are coming up. Okay, so without further ado, I am almost reaching 5 minutes. I will introduce our chair for today's session. He's none other than Assistant Professor Dr. Wen Ching Nui. He's the Assistant Professor of Humanities in the College of Integrative Studies at the SMU, Singapore Management University. Dr. Nui graduated with a PhD in history from the Northwestern University, specializing in US foreign relations with a strong focus on Southeast Asia in the 20th century, so just a little bit back. Before joining SMU, Dr. Ngui completed postdoctoral stints at Northwestern and Yale University and was assistant professor of history at the NTU from 2016 to 2019. He himself, an established scholar, have published his first book titled The Arc of Containment, Britain, the United States, and Anti-Communism in Southeast Asia, published by the CUP, Cornell University Press in 2019. So I'm sure Dr. Ngui will bring a rich perspective to in the discussion later on. So without further ado, can we just put our hands together for Dr. Ngui? Thank you so much.
I won't take up too much time this evening. Good evening, thanks for being here. It's an honor to chair the Q&A later for Dr. Chen Wen Kung's book launch this evening and to introduce him before he speaks about diasporic Cold Warriors. So Dr. Kung is an assistant professor in the NUS Department of History. Born and raised in Singapore, he was a history and English major at Dartmouth College, and he taught A-level history in a local junior college before pursuing his PhD in modern Chinese and international and global history at Columbia University. Dr. Kung's research straddles the fields of... My friends in the back, we're about to start. Do you think that you can keep your conversation volume down? Thank you. Dr. Kung's research straddles the fields of Sinophone history, Chinese migration and diaspora, the Cold War, and modern China in the world. He was previously a visiting assistant professor of East Asian history at the University of the Pacific and a postdoctoral fellow at the NUS Department of History. Now, on a personal note, Chen Wen has been a great friend and a fellow historian. I've always been able to count on him for support, to listen to my outlandish project ideas, and to give valuable feedback, and to render all kinds of assistance when I've hit a research roadblock. Like him, I was also once upon a time a history teacher in a junior college, and over the years, as I've encountered his ex-students in various contexts, they've always asked me, do you know Chen Wen? And they always have good things to say about him. I've no doubt he brings the same inspiration and brilliance to his classes in NUS today, which is why so many of you are here, not least the fact that you can get extra points when you ask questions later. I want to say that he's the best kind of scholar, generous with his time as well as his knowledge. And also, I think he's very cool because, like me, he's a fan of Star Wars. So I won't keep speaking much longer. I'll just say, may the force be with you, Chen Wen, and please take it away.
Thank you, Wenqing, and thank you, Elmi, for your very generous introductions. I am absolutely delighted to be here to talk about my book and some of its broader implications for the study of Chinese and Cold War history. So what is this book about? This book explains how and why, at the height of the Cold War, the Philippine Chinese became the most ardent diasporic supporters of the Republic of China and Taiwan and its ruling Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, right, in this region. For all the fears of Chinese communism at the time, the China, quote-unquote, that intervened the most extensively in any Southeast Asian country during this period was not the PRC, but the ROC. My story begins in the first half of the 20th century, during which the KMT institutionalized itself in the Philippines and clashed with pro-communist, left-wing Chinese organizations in the years leading up to the Japanese occupation. Notably, the Philippine KMT became dominated over time by a right-wing faction with ties to the quasi-fascist blue shirts in China. The Secretary General of the Kuomintang in Taiwan from 1985 to 1987, Ma Shuli, was briefly part of this faction in the Philippines in the 1930s. By the end of the 1940s, however, following what the Kuomintang called a period of bloody struggle between left and right-wing Chinese factions in the Philippines, the majority of Philippine Chinese left-wing leaders had returned to China, right? Enabling Taipei to consolidate its hold over one of the smallest overseas Chinese communities in Southeast Asia, with the participation of the Philippine government. So this is a Cold War narrative, right? But the United States does not feature prominently in it, and so it's not a narrative that fits nicely with how we understand the Cold War in this part of the world. Nationalist China's influence in the Philippines was characterized by its near hegemony over Chinese education and key community institutions, including the Federation of Filipino-Chinese Chambers of Commerce and Industry, the Kuomintang Chiang Kai-shek College in Manila, right, and the Philippine Chinese Anti-Communist League. Through these organizations, Taipei mobilized the Philippine Chinese, most of whom were legally ROC nationals, in support of its overarching goal of counterattacking the mainland and opposing communism and resisting Russia, or Fangongkang. So during these decades, visits to Taiwan, such as those you see here, were common. The cover of my book is based on the photo on the left, which shows Chiang Kai-shek greeting Philippine Chinese students who were in Taiwan for military service. And on the right, a Philippine KMT member is presenting Chiang with a 3D gold map of China in 1950. Now, more perniciously, the Kuomintang collaborated with the coercive organs of the Philippine state, in particular Philippine military intelligence, to silence dissenting and heterodox voices within the community by identifying them as communists. And many such persons actually ended up being deported to Taiwan, including Quintin and Rizal Yutong of the Chinese Commercial News, which was the Philippines' most widely read Chinese newspaper at the time. Their so-called crime as liberals was to have provided balanced news coverage of developments in China and Taiwan, and to have advocated for Chinese cultural integration into the Filipino body politic, right, in opposition to the Kuomintang's ethnocentrism and Sinocentrism. And so my book ends with these two men in the 1970s, right, Quintin and Rizal Yutong, after which things changed rapidly. Under martial law, right, which was declared 50 years ago, Ferdinand Marcos vastly simplified the naturalization process for foreign nationals and established formal diplomatic relations between Manila and Beijing in 1975. So over time, Kuomintang influence waned in proportion to, as ties between the Philippines and the other China expanded. Now, I'm now going to talk a little bit about my arguments. How do I position myself in relation to what fields of scholarship? This is a tricky question, given that my topic doesn't fit easily, I think, into area studies subfields, such as China or Southeast Asia, or even Chinese migration history. Right? So I can pick and choose my scholarly engagements pretty carefully, and in the end, for practical reasons, I settled on three interventions. The first of these interventions is addressed at historians of modern China and Taiwan, right? Particularly those in Anglo-American academia, who have written about the Kuomintang chiefly from the area studies perspective of its nation-building strategies and ideology during the Nanjing decade, right? 1928 to 1937, right? During the Sino-Japanese War and in Taiwan after World War II in 1949. And so this is how I encountered the Kuomintang in graduate school, right? Through scholarship by, for example, Brian Sway and by Maggie Clinton. And it's typically, I think, how historians and the general reading public today envision the party. And so in my conversations with China historians, they frequently express surprise that there was a KMT in the Philippines at all. Yet if you read Kuomintang propaganda from the 1930s 1930s onwards, or indeed dig into its archives, right, or dig into the archives of the ROC Foreign Ministry in Taiwan, it becomes readily apparent that the party state was very keen on the mobilization of persons whom it legally defined and referred to as overseas Chinese, or Huaqiao. Right? The ROC's 1929 nationality law formally defined quote-unquote Chinese nationals according to the principle of jus sanguinis. Right? Pretty much anyone of Chinese ancestry living overseas. And so, that's my first intervention, right? Next, by building on a much sizable and an older body of scholarship on the Kuomintang in Southeast Asia, right? I make the case for understanding the Kuomintang as a networked and transnational organization that connected China and Taiwan to Chinese communities abroad. Although it overlapped with and leveraged the migration networks that Adam McKeown and other historians of the Chinese diaspora have studied, the Kuomintang is fundamentally a different type of transnational formation. One whose branches, schools, civic institutions, and diplomatic organs were both embedded in overseas Chinese societies, right, or Haiwan, right, and linked hierarchically to the center of Zhongyang, right, whether that center was in Nanjing, Chongqing, or Taipei. So thinking about the KMT transnationally underscores, I think, the territorial incompleteness and partial sovereignty of this particular entity called the Republic of China, right, from its inception in 1912 and in the eyes of its partisans. And this explains the party states turning outwards towards Nanyang and elsewhere in search of support. Now, can we think about the CCP and the PRC diasporically? My book, especially from the 1950s onward, focuses almost exclusively on the Kuomintang and anti-communism than on Chinese left-wing movements. But I would definitely say that we can think about Chinese communism diasporically, as for example, Zhou Tamo has pointed out. I'd argue that despite the presence of ethnic Chinese communist sympathizers overseas, both alleged and actual, the CCP was not as formally institutionalized diasporically to the extent that the KMT was. Moreover, unlike the Kuomintang, the CCP after 1949 focused largely on nation building in a more conventional, territorialized sense. And it officially jettisoned its ethno, legal, and ideological claims upon the Chinese diaspora from the mid-1950s onwards, from about the Bandung Conference onwards. Conversely, the ROC engaged in no such act of repudiation and maintained, in fact, jus sanguinis citizenship all the way until the year 2000. My second argument, right, is about understanding the three-way relationship between the Kuomintang, the Philippine state, and the Philippine Chinese, and using this three-way relationship to rethink the Cold War in this part of the world. So drawing upon the political scientist Stephen Krasner, right, I argue that Taipei-Manila relations with respect to the Philippine Chinese constitute an arrangement of shared sovereignty. It was a marriage convenience characterized by shifting but relatively equal power relations between Taipei and Manila, and by the willingness of the latter to both allow the KMT to operate openly in the Philippines and to collaborate with the Kuomintang and the Chinese community to eliminate the bugbear of Chinese communism. So Manila relied on ROC diplomats and Kuomintang activists to compensate, right, for Philippine military intelligence's ignorance of Chinese, right? Taipei lacked the means to simply impose itself onto the Philippines without Manila's participation and consent, right, as it itself acknowledged. And I think its proscription, the Kuomintang's proscription by the authorities in other Southeast Asian countries during this period, Malaya, Thailand, and South Vietnam, for example, underscores. So this is what I think makes the Philippines distinct as a case study. Shared sovereignty is also useful for me in engaging with and narratives of the Cold War in East Asia. Right? So on the one hand, my book aligns with Ching Guan is here, Ching Guan, and Wen Xing, right? Who have called attention to how important fears of the PRC and the overseas Chinese as potential fifth columnists were to understanding the dynamics of the Cold War in this part of the world. But on the other hand, and this may come as a bit of a surprise to you, this is not a US-centric narrative, even if the states involved were close allies of the United States. So the US is not absent, right, from this book, which draws quite extensively on US archival materials, but the materials suggest that US involvement in the Philippine Chinese community was primarily that of an observer and did not go very far beyond disseminating propaganda, right, after 1950. It was the Kuomintang and Taipei that drove the propaganda effort on the ground. It was the Philippine military in partnership with Kuomintang and not the US that did the dirty work of identifying and arresting so-called communists. So my book is in part a response to historians of the United States and the world, right, and to the US-Asia binary that structures a lot of narratives of the Cold War in this region. So in other words, I am seeking to decenter the United States and emphasize the agency and relative autonomy of Asian and transnational actors in constructing Cold War anti-communism, right, between states and peoples. And so these relations help constitute what I call, adapting anthropologist Susan Bailey's concept of a socialist ecumene, an intra-Asian anti-communist ecumene, comprising Kuomintang networks, flows of Philippine Chinese students, teachers, and tourists back and forth between the Philippines and Taiwan, right, as well as transnational anti-communist organizations, such as the Asian People's Anti-Communist League. So finally, as a work of social and cultural history, my book challenges prevailing narratives of Philippine Chinese history and society that are focused on ethnocultural identity and integration, right? That focus on the business community to the exclusion of Cold War politics and ideology. So for example, in narratives of the Chinoy community, produced by Chinoys themselves, such as this handsome coffee table book, right, produced by the leading Chino organization, Kaisa Para Sa Kamaran. The KMT and Taiwan are conspicuous by their absence. This is understandable, right? Given that these narratives emphasize the contributions of Chinese migrants and their descendants to a multicultural Filipino nation in response to endemic anti-Chinese racism, discrimination, and accusations of disloyalty, which unfortunately have intensified in recent years. Even the Kuomintang hegemony is well known among older Chinoys, as my conversations with them reveal. It is, I think, politically inconvenient for the community to highlight how an earlier generation of Philippine Chinese, right, were vociferous supporters of the ROC. Now we also find, in what little scholarship there is on the post-war Filipino Chinese, an inordinate emphasis on the business community, whose interests are depicted as synonymous with local Chinese society's interests in general, right? And whom social scientists frequently tend to depict as uninterested in politics, right? Focused simply on adapting to discriminatory economic and legal policies. In other words, there is a rupture, I think, between the oddly depoliticized narratives of the post-1945 period and narratives of the pre-1945 period that are attentive to, for example, mobilization and support of the war of resistance against Japan. And so my argument in response to these narratives is as follows. First, we need to think about how the sharing of sovereignty between Taipei and Manila, right, how transnational KMT networks and how Cold War ideology shaped Chinese identity in the Philippines and were instrumental to how the Chinese fashioned themselves as post-colonial subjects, as ethno-ideological subjects, right, in the face of discrimination and prejudice. We need to go beyond tropes of hybridity and interculturation and beyond the narrow confines of ethnicity and culture, because for many Filipino Chinese as legal aliens and ethnic minorities, performing the rite ideology. An ideology shared by the ROC and the Philippine states was a means for these persons to prove that they were good residents of the Philippines. They were means to ingratiate oneself with the authorities, to win intra-communal power struggles, and to profit by means of criminal activity. So ideology in this sense is both about belief and expediency. It's tricky for historians, I think, to parse the motivations of persons, historical figures, right? We prefer studying manifestations of interiority, right? And in my case, this would be the performative aspects of Cold War anti-communism. So from forming civic organizations such as the Filipino-Chinese Anti-Communist League, right, fundraising to support the ROC, activities such as blackmailing and informing on Chinese communist state, right? These practices helped Chinese in the Philippines mitigate racial prejudices towards them by emphasizing their ideological bona fides. And not all such practicing anti-communists were businessmen. Right? I get asked a lot about economic ties between the Filipino-Chinese and the ROC, and my response to these questions is that such ties existed, I am sure, but have proven difficult to study. Furthermore, my book is about more than just a business community. While the business community certainly supported the ROC, the most enthusiastic diasporic Cold Warriors were not businessmen, but journalists, media figures, educators affiliated with the Kuomintang. Right? Like Bao Shitian, for example, the longtime principal of Chiang Kai-shek College, right? Like the man on the bottom left, Xin Guangzhu, who was the editor-in-chief of the Great China Press, which is the KMT mouthpiece. Right? Like radio host Mary Yu, for example, shown here posing with Chiang Kai-shek in 1961, and like Ma Shu-yi, whom I mentioned at the start of the lecture. And so finally, on the question of ideology, in the absence of Chinese left-wing movements in the Philippines after the late 1940s, where might one turn to for evidence of resistance to the Kuomintang? Right? So my book is, I would say my book is a study in hegemony, right? in cultural hegemony even, but this hegemony was not uncontested. That said, contestation manifested itself indirectly and obliquely as what I call anti-anti-communism or non-anti-communism, rather than in the form of full-throated support for the PRC. So the Chinese commercial news, for example, registered its discomfort with the ideological status quo by publishing articles that both praised and criticized both the ROC and the PRC, right? By critiquing the Kuomintang's ethnocentrism, right? By performing, in other words, an alternative ethno-ideological subjectivity. And so for that reason, the Yuzhong brothers, right, ran afoul of the establishment and were deported to Taiwan. So those are my three historiographical claims, right, on the transnational of the Kuomintang, about the sharing of sovereignty in the context of the intra-Asian Cold War, and about the significance of ideology to understanding Chinese identity. I want to close with a few thoughts on the broader implications of the book and where we can go from here. So, first, the question of comparisons. My book isn't a comparative history, although there are moments where I look beyond the Philippines to other Southeast Asian countries, about whose Kuomintangs we actually know little about, right? Yet I think that the book supplies concepts and narratives that translate across borders and can help illuminate the Kuomintang elsewhere in the region. There are rich deposits of primary sources from which to draw. And in writing about shared sovereignty, I hope that others will think about how colonial and post-colonial states after 1945 constrained the operations of Chinese political organizations among Chinese populations, right, in the name of assimilating them into national body politics. Second, conclusion. I hope that my book can be helpful in historicizing relations between China and Southeast Asia. So rather than tracing a linear trajectory between the PRC today and back then, I call attention to the ROC as an antecedent to the PRC's involvement in the region in our time. So if we can draw synchronic comparisons between the Kuomintang and the CCP as authoritarian Leninist regimes, then we can also engage in diachronic analogizing between the Kuomintang in history and the CCP today. For example, with respect to their shared commitment to promoting a certain form of Chineseness, right, in sinicizing or re-sinicizing the region's Chinese. It's telling, I think, that a current Chinese commercial news employee, whose father also worked for the paper, said to me that Beijing's cultural diplomacy among the Philippine Chinese today resembles what Taipei was doing half a century earlier. Finally, I hope that, again, we, when I say we here, I chiefly mean scholars, right, embedded within North American area studies. I hope that we can move beyond Chinese history as a field that is centered on the mainland as a territorialized space for the unfolding of the Chinese past. Even recent books on the Chinese diaspora, even really good books by the likes of Shelley Chan and Wayne Soon, I'd argue, are China-centered in that they are principally concerned with how the diaspora changed China, right? And in Wayne's case, the ROC on Taiwan as well. So I would like to propose an alternative, non-exclusive, and constructivist approach, inspired in part by Adam McEwen's scholarship, by critical Han studies, right, and by Sinophone literary and cultural studies. I sometimes refer to this as global Chinese history, which is a field that emphasizes the experiences and connections between persons, societies, and states that saw themselves or were seen by others as Chinese. At the same time, I do not want to limit myself to literary and cultural texts exclusively. And so such an approach treats sinicization and de-sinicization in China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Southeast Asia, right, in relation to Manchus, right, to Uyghurs, to the indigenous peoples of Taiwan, to Chinois and Hong Kongers, and ethnic Chinese Singaporeans. I treat these processes of sinicization and de-sinicization and re-sinicization as comparable, as processes that span geographies and that are enmeshed in distinct historical contexts and political processes. And I think this approach invariably has political and ethical ramifications. The terms Chinese and China are powerful but ambiguous and contested signifiers. And racist demagogues and authoritarian states, right, PRC today, martial law Taiwan, Indonesia, have deployed these terms to categorize, essentialize, and inflict great harm on peoples. And so for such reasons, I think we owe it to our peers and publics to problematize Chineseness and Chinese history. That is all I have for you today. Thank you very much for your attention. If you are interested in buying the book, I regretfully do not have copies of the book to sell today. And if you are in this part of the world, you can do so from combined academic publishers and get 30% off by using the code on the screen. So that's all I have to say today. I look forward to the ensuing discussion.
Thanks very much, Dr. Kung, for the talk. And we're moving now into the Q&A segment of this evening. We have about half an hour. I'd like to hear from all of you. And there are two mics on the two sides. Please line up behind the mic, and then I'll call you as and when. And also, before before you ask your question, please identify yourself. And this is so that Dr. Kung can note down your name and give you extra participation points when he sees you next time in class. Alright, so please go ahead, approach the microphones and just call. It looks like someone has already.
Okay. Hi, I have a question. My name is Saika Chokani. I'm a assistant professor in U.S. History Department. Thank you for the wonderful talk, and I can always ask you questions anytime. So I appreciate the combination of you two scholars today. So I want to ask this question specifically because two of you are here. I want to ask you about the context of decolonization in Southeast Asia, and because there's a lot of discussion about how to think about the Cold War, because decolonization might be the bigger story here, right? And then, especially in Southeast Asia. So I'm wondering, how does this story fit in the larger story of decolonization of the Philippines? And I'm asking this question because I'm studying, as you know, Korean diaspora in Japan and how they aspire to become North Korean citizens. Has a lot to do with how Japan did or did not decolonize Koreans or Korea. So I'm wondering if it has a lot to do with how the Philippines processed decolonization or not with the United States, and how the story of Manila and Taipei relationship fit in the sort of larger foreign policy or the state of Manila of this period.
Thanks, Saga, for that great question, which I've not actually, I've talked about various aspects of my book on a number of occasions, and I actually have not gotten that question before. But it's a really pertinent question. How does the book fit into the broader history of the decolonization of the Philippines? Again, it's difficult to disentangle the Cold War and decolonization when it comes to talking about Southeast Asian history, and my book certainly does not attempt to do so. But my book, I think, calls attention to a very important aspect of decolonization, which is how newly independent countries, how they ought to approach the so-called Chinese question. Right? Interestingly enough, there's a new book out by the Columbian historian May Nai called The Chinese Question, but that's largely centered on Chinese communities in white settler colonies such as the United States and Australia. But there's a book called The Chinese Question by one of my advisors, Caroline Howe, which came out several years earlier. So Southeast Asian states had their own Chinese question to deal with, right? And that after 1945 and with decolonization, this question came very much to the forefront of states, and the approaches varied, right? Some were more forceful, some paid far more attention to the question than others. Indonesia is the example that gets used a lot here, especially after 1967. But the Philippines had its own Chinese question, and my book explains how the state went about that. Right? And that in the Philippines case, they dealt with the Chinese question by not really dealing with the Chinese question. They chose to outsource management of the Chinese community to Taipei. Right? In the overall scheme of things, the Philippine state at the time, I think, had bigger fish to fry. Right? They had a rural insurgency. Right? Balahat, for example, to deal with. There was minimal Chinese participation in that. Right? But the Chinese community was sufficiently small and non-troublesome, right, for the state, right, a state that suffered from all sorts of incapacities, right, to be like, okay, we don't really need to worry too much about our Chinese community. We consider them to be foreign, right, and we're not terribly interested in integrating them. right? But so long as they're not, so long as they're not up in arms, taking up arms against us, that's fine. We can let others deal with them. And that's one approach to the Chinese question. That's one way of going about decolonization, by letting other people do the job for you. Again, not an approach that other states adopted, but I think the contrast there is important.
Do you really need to hear from me? Okay, just so very quickly, I think about decolonization. I try to decenter decolonization. I think of it as imperialism and its persistence, as the Western powers, as well as their collaborators in Southeast Asia, intertwine their goals in a kind of neo-colonial project in order to tilt their country, their successor state, Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, as they tilt their successor state towards the West for capitalist enrichment, to align with the West because of anti-Chinese prejudice. So, in conversation with Chetwin's book, there is so much paranoia and so much hatred of the Chinese diaspora in many of the Southeast Asian countries that is centuries long, and it becomes a glue between the colonial era and the Cold War era, such that colonialism has its opportunity to persist since people are able to switch their target of Chinese in our midst to Chinese in our midst who will be a fifth column for Beijing. And that enables the West and local collaborators to come together much more easily. So that's the way I would think about decolonization, as a kind of not actually happening in the way that we wish or might think. Okay, another question from yourself. Yes.
Hi, Prof. I'm Jonah from your HY 101 class. So I guess I'm here for the spatial points. So one of the interesting things I took from my presentation was the primacy of civil society coming down ultra-nationalist activism, primarily within the schools and the media. So I was wondering, and this made me think about parallels, for example, in pre-war Japan and post-war Japan as well. So I was wondering if you could possibly, if you see any potential for a unique sort of Southeast Asian model of sort of tabloid nationalism that differs from what you saw in, for example, Europe and America. Thanks for that question, Jonah. Did you say tabloid nationalism? Like this idea of the newspapers and the schools and what you could loosely, broadly call civil society as the center of the ultra-nationalist activism. Yeah, I wouldn't. For the pre-war Japan comparisons, you might want to talk to Dr. Chitani about that. I'm not sure I'm capable of engaging in those comparisons, but I will say that the newspapers are a key sort of field of. That was a great question, by the way. Although I was not entirely sure what you meant by tabloid nationalism. Newspapers were an arena for ideological struggles, where you see these struggles sort of playing themselves out, right? Although to a large extent, that's because newspapers are among those sources that we have access to, right? And that certainly, if we look at Southeast Asia in general, the newspaper, the media landscape, right, is rife with contestation and polarization and debate wherever you turn. Right? The Philippines, it's like that. We don't, unfortunately, in the Philippines case, the pre-war newspapers largely do not, we no longer have them. They've gone, disintegrated, been destroyed. But even the post-war newspapers haven't necessarily survived because of neglect, right? But certainly the newspaper scene was where you find these nationalisms seek to represent themselves, right? Particularly during moments of acute conflict between, say, the Philippines and between, say, China and the ROC and the PRC, right? At the height of the Cold War, right? Early on, the simple answer to the question is that early on, after 1945, right after the war ends, the newspaper scene is especially lively. You have newspapers. You have left-wing newspapers are particularly active right after 1945. And so too are KMT newspapers, because both the KMT and pro-left, these Chinese elements have contributed to the war effort, right, and are eager to sort of proclaim their achievements during the war. So this conflict, which is captured in fragments in these newspapers, is also a conflict that unfolds on the streets, right, between factions, right, over questions of collaboration, for example. But then by the end of the 1950s, a lot of these smaller papers, basically, they've gone out of business, right? The thing about newspapers is that it's easy the startup costs are low, but they go out of business easily. So by the end of the 1940s, right around the time that China, mainland China goes red, right? The Chinese newspaper scene in the Philippines becomes more homogenous. It becomes more right-wing. That by the 1950s, there are 4 Chinese broadsheets in the country, 2 of which are Kuomintang organs, one of which is a centrist but pro-Chiang Kai-shek organ, independently owned, and the 4th of which is the Chinese Commercial News, which is by all accounts, a centrist liberal newspaper that gets perceived as left-wing because of just how skewed the political spectrum in the Philippines is. And then, of course, during martial law, newspapers get shut down, and that's a different story. But that's how nationalism plays itself out in the newspapers. Right? And the Chinese Commercial News tries to avoid nationalism by playing both sides, right? But that can get into trouble with it into trouble with the extreme right.
Thank you. Other questions? Very nice to step up to the mic. Please go ahead. And don't worry, Dr. Kong is used to extended silence because he's been a former teacher, so he can wait you out. Yes, go ahead. Please tell us your name.
My name is Fu Zhenxi. I'm a graduate student here, so I'm also going to get my extra credit. So just how much though? Yeah, so just like simple questions about like why do we end at the 1970s? So is that because of the formal relationship built between the CCP and like other countries like Philippines that like made like Kuomintang just like give up like using such strategies like continue or yeah.
Okay, yeah. So your question is why the book ends in the 70s?
Yeah, why 1970? Is there like 1970s?
Right. Why it's a watershed?
Transition about like Kuomintang's strategy.
Yeah. I mean, if I had, I would love to see someone write a book on pick up where I left off, right, and write about what happens after the 1970s. But a book can only do so much. The 1970s is a turning point, right? That especially after the US and the PRC normalized relations, right? Many Southeast Asian states follow suit, right? And that certainly applies to the Philippines, right? Which, for reasons that I go into in the conclusion, though not in great detail, right, decides that it's perfectly fine at this point in time to establish, to establish diplomatic relations, because by that point in time, Ferdinand Marcos actually he sort of commissions sort of policy analysts and scholars to study Chinese society, and he comes to the conclusion that even if Manila establishes ties with Beijing, this will not affect the Chinese community. The Chinese community will not all of a sudden decide to become, decide to cheerlead on behalf of Beijing, right? In other words, they've effectively been immunized against communist views by Kuomintang hegemony over the past couple of decades. And so Marcos's reasons for normalizing relations are pretty complex. They have to do with, obviously, martial law lets him do things like shut down Chinese schools, right? Martial law lets him simplify the naturalization process, enabling many Chinese Filipinos to take up Filipino citizenship without having to go through a complex, expensive judicial process, right? He believes that having diplomatic relations with China will actually help keep sort of local Filipino communists in check, right? So there are all sorts of reasons why and it's not simply that he's looking to what the US is doing and following suit, right? Marcos has his own agenda as the conclusion to my book explains. And so it's really a watershed moment, I think, for the Philippines, but also other Southeast Asian countries as well, right? The Vietnam War, the Second Indochina War rather comes to an end in 1975, right? And then again, it sort of, Ching-Wan will correct me if I'm wrong here, but again, that signals a waning down of the Cold War in this part of the world, right? With the end of the Vietnam conflict, and that's why. But the Kuomintang influence actually persists after 1975. Interestingly enough, right? It takes a surprisingly long time for the community to sort of marginalize the Kuomintang. Right? What happens after 1975 is that the pro-CCP elements who have been remaining deathly quiet within the community all this while are able and willing to speak up, right? But it takes a long time before we get to it's only in the 1990s, in fact, that the PRC can be said, I think, to have gained an upper hand in the community. Thank you for that question. I made note of.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah,
sure. One of the things that you said was about the performative aspects of anti-communism, right? Because the Chinese Filipinos have to perform anti-communism. They have to sort of persecute perceived or alleged Chinese communists in their midst, and that way you perform the right ideology, then you're the good Chinese in the Philippines. So what is the afterlife of this performativity, right? If I'm using performativity appropriately, I'm sure that some people might not be happy with the way they use the word, but anyway, what is the afterlife of it? Building on the question that he asked. Now that there are links or diplomatic relations with the PRC, do you still need to be a good Chinese? You've said that Marcos kind of doesn't feel that they're that much of a threat anymore. So what do they perform now, or do they not perform? What happens?
That's a great question. Again, my book ends in the 1970s, so I don't really go too much into that. But again, this is martial law, right? And one has to be very careful about performing one's political beliefs during martial law, right? Newspapers are shut down, for example, right? It's important during martial. It's even more important during martial law to cultivate appropriate relations with the guy in power, right? Or the family in power, right? So I'm not sure there's the anti-communist organizations that I talked about just now. They sort of dwindle away, right? They go quiet and then they eventually disband. Right? There's no need for them to be quite so vociferous about performing their anti-communist credentials, right? By this point in time, it's a sign perhaps that the worst of the Cold War, the peak of the Cold War is coming on.
Please approach the mic.
Hi, I'm Florence Mock from NTU. I'm a Nanyang Assistant Professor of History and mainly work on Hong Kong. So I'm interested in knowing more about the ROC presence in the Philippines from more like a comparative and also transnational perspective. So how did the ideologies, the nationalists propagate in the Philippines differ from other places? And also, whether the presence of ROC in the Philippines affect other strategic locations in which there were KMT influence. Let's say, for example, Hong Kong. Thank you.
Thanks, Florence. So your first question was on how the Kuomintang propagated its influence.
How does it differ?
Oh, how it differs, how it compares, right? Again, my book really isn't really a comparative history, and so I don't talk about. I point out in some of my chapters that Kuomintang influence in other parts of Southeast Asia was much more circumscribed, and that if we look at things from the Kuomintang's own point of view, things were much rosier in the Philippines in, say, the mid-1950s than they were, say, in Indonesia, for example, or other parts of East Asia. So I don't really delve into these explicitly into comparisons, with respect, for example, to propagation of influence. But here's one thing that the Kuomintang did with respect to multiple Chinese communities across the region, and that was to get them to visit Taiwan, right? Was to get them to organize visits to Taiwan, and oftentimes, and the Philippines they were the most enthusiastic about this, but other Chinese communities in the region did so as well. They sent delegations to Taiwan, and when they were in Taiwan, they got to meet with Chiang Kai-shek, right? Take pictures with him, shake his hand, right? They got to go to Quemoy, Jimen, right, as well. They got shown around the battlefield, right? And were guided tours, essentially, right? Chinese youth, ethnic Chinese youth from Southeast Asia throughout Southeast Asia got to travel to Taiwan and take part in, for example, summer programs, for example. They got to engage in what was known as Junzhongfu, right? Or, for lack of a better term, military service, right? Which could be quite sensitive as well. Taiwan was also a source of expertise, right? Of cultural expertise for many ethnic Chinese communities in the region. Taiwan liked to advertise itself as a place where you could go to learn how to teach Chinese. So for educators across the region who were concerned about the state of Chinese culture and the state of Chinese education, right? Taiwan was where you could go, right? You could go to Taiwan to do a summer intensive program in pedagogy, which you got to visit. You got to visit schools, right? You got to attend teacher training programs, right? All of which, of course, were efforts at representing the ROC in a positive light to these communities. Right? And these visits are really inseparable from the ROC's efforts at cultural diplomacy and propaganda throughout the region. And Hong Kong, again, would have figured as part of this, would have figured in the ROC's worldview, because it's interesting, and you probably know this, that in Kuomintang propaganda, Hong Kong is referred to sometimes as overseas Chinese, right? Which is a strange way of describing them, but Hong Kong, statistics on Hong Kong's Chinese population, right, were frequently, you could find Hong Kong included data on Hong Kong alongside data on, say, Chinese in the Philippines, South Vietnam, and elsewhere, right? So it's clear from the statistics that the Overseas Chinese Affairs Commission compiled, for example, that the Kuomintang was thinking comparatively and transnationally. They generated tons and tons of empirical evidence, right, on like investment statistics, on the number of visits per year, for example. All in an effort to sort of concretize its place in the world as a state, right, that was doing things, right, that was representing its people. Yes?
Hi, Dr. Combs. Thanks for your talk. So my name is Joshua. I'm a PhD student at the University of California, and as of last week, doing a research fellowship at NLB. So two questions. The first is, about generational change, because you go from the 30s to the 70s, right? So I'm thinking, was there a transition in terms of how performative anti-communism, performative Chineseness transitioned before the war, after the war, I think 1949, between the Nanjing government and the PMA government, were there changes? Second question is about, you want to decent in the US, but in a way, I'm wondering whether there were any kind of points of contention or points of disagreement between the US and Taipei in terms of how it was conducting its extraterritorial interventions in the Philippines and elsewhere. I know in terms of the Taipei's Chaoshen policy, right, there was a lot of disagreement between the US in terms of how much it would sponsor overseas Chinese students to go to Taiwan. So, two questions. Thanks.
Yeah. Yes, there were definitely generational changes, and that explains, I think, why Marcos did not think it was risky to normalize relations in 1975, starting in the early 1970s. It's the younger, it's this younger generation of Chinoys, Chinoys who were born in the Philippines, who grew up speaking Filipino languages, right, as well as Chinese languages, right, who attended, and particularly those who are educated at local universities, right, those form call them a resistance, but those were among the earliest to push back against Kuomintang hegemony, right, by establishing organizations, civil organizations that call, for example, for simplifying the naturalization process and granting jus soli citizenship, for example. So it's this generation whose views are represented in the Chinese commercial news. A generation of Chinese who see themselves more as Filipino, as having been born and as belonging to the Philippines, even if they may have Chinese ancestry. And so it's this generation. These generational changes do explain, right, the waning of Kuomintang influence over time, right. Second question on decenting the U.S. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the Kuomintang there's stuff going on at sort of the interstate level between the US and the ROC with respect to Chaohu policy, for example, which I'm not really interested in, right? I'm more interested in what was going on the ground. And what's interesting, if you look, for example, at Kuomintang intelligence report, or ROC Foreign Ministry intelligence reports, which were the most widely available sources, you find that there's very little mention of U.S. involvement. In fact, there's one episode in chapter 4 of my book, which involving the mass arrest of some 300 Chinese in December 1952, which is conducted by the Philippine military, right, with Chinese informants, right. And this comes as a great surprise not only to Kuomintang, but also to U.S. intelligence. U.S. intelligence looks to Kuomintang like, were you involved in this? No. Were you involved in this? No. So the U.S., again, I think the U.S. had bigger fish to fry in the Philippines at the time. It obviously paid attention to what was going on in the Chinese community, right? But really, in the 1950s, the U.S.'s attention, and indeed most of the Philippine state's attention, again, was focused very much on the local communist problem, and they were, in the eyes of conservative elites, a real problem, right? The Hukbalahap. And the Chinese, again, how did the Chinese fit into that? Well, there were suspected ties, obviously, between Chinese and Hukbalahap, but those ties were, as far as we can tell, pretty minimal. And so again, the U.S., I think, was quite happy with the arrangements. This arrangement of shared sovereignty that Taipei and Manila had sort of stumbled upon, right? And that it was quite willing again to sort of let others do the work for it. So the U.S. sources that I read made it clear that the U.S. was interested and attentive to what was going on, but did not play the kind of same hands-on role that Kuomintang did, right? Like again, you see references, for example, in Asia Foundation records to, let's give some money to a local Chinese school to bring in some books by George Orwell, for example. But that's about as far as the US is going. And that's not really getting itself involved in the affairs of the community.
Yeah, I think we have time for one or at the most two questions. This gentleman has come up to the mic and then I'll go to you. So please try to make your question short, make your answer short as well. And then we'll be able to have room for both. Yeah, go ahead please.
Sure. Okay, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation earlier. I'm Winston, I'm from the Political Science Department. Yeah, so my question actually, it looks at, it sort of looks at the term ethno-ideological nationalism, and I was wondering actually, because there's an inflection point that I see in the period from 1930 to 1917, from the 1930s to 1970s, and that is in 1949, after the Battle of Jinmen. Yeah, so after the Battle of Jinmen, I was wondering if the decades after there was sort of split in the identity, the ethnic identity, between the Chinese and the Taiwanese, and if people in the Philippines, if there was a subset in the Filipino-Chinese community that exhibited Taiwanese nationalism after the 1960s and onwards, yeah. And then I guess I follow up to on the primary sources in that the KMT itself recognized that fact and maybe even moved towards Taiwanese nationalism after maybe the 1960s and 1970s. Yeah, that would be all. Yeah, my questions.
Yeah, can we just get Grace's question? Sorry.
So you hear all the questions and you'll be able to address them. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Grace. I'm also from his graduate class, so I'm here for extra credit. I just have a question on, you talked about them carrying out the dirty work, like on behalf of like the Philippine government. So I was just wondering, how did this carrying out of dirty work play out in like the day-to-day life? So in a way, how did they perform this anti-communism on like an everyday communal level, besides the newspapers and the media?
Yeah. Oh, wait, there's one more. Two more questions? Okay.
Okay, I think that he'll answer those two questions. Then we'll try to close this because I think it's time. But to please approach later. You can still get extra credit there. Okay. So we'll just address those three questions. Maybe we can hear from you as well.
Taiwanese nationalism, no evidence of that in the archives. There's some talk of Taiwanese independence activists fleeing to the Philippines, but there's absolutely no sign of Taiwanese nationalism or independence movements among the Philippine Chinese. Right? In fact, even the Yu Tong brothers come out and say in an interview many years later that they do not support Taiwanese independence. What does dirty work? Grace's question. That's a great question. What does dirty work entail? Dirty work entails, going to your local police branch and telling them that this person's a communist, right? You might want to look into that, right? And then going to that person whom you've accused of being a communist and saying, I heard you've been accused of being a communist. I can help clear your name, but I need some payment for that. So that happens a lot actually. You find a lot of blackmailing and going on right in the 1950s as members of the community, especially those affiliated with the Kuomintang, try to establish reputations for themselves. Right? They start magazines in which they talk about their efforts at aiding and helping the Filipino government, right, with its counterintelligence efforts, for example. Right? So they are very eager and enthusiastic about getting their name out there in the headlines. sure that people know that they are well-connected people, that they're well-connected within the community and have intelligence on communists, right? Because it becomes a resource, it becomes a commodity almost that you can trade and sell, right, to boost your reputation.
So very quickly we'll hear from you and then also yourself. So maybe you can stand the mic and block off anybody who's coming in. Alright, go ahead.
I'm also from your graduate course, and I have read your previous book called Nationalist China in the Post-Colonial Philippines.
Oh, my dissertation.
Yeah. You mentioned that CNP has influenced education, economy, and policy making in the Philippines. I wonder if CNP has any influence on the region of Chinese Philippines, like holding some religious event to fight communism. Thank you.
And then we can hear from you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Augustine. I'm from NUS, but from literature, so I'm not here for points. My work is on Cold War Malaya, and I think one of the sort of a comparative question that I find is interesting to think about the different positionalities within the Chinese community. So like you have the Peranakans, and then you have the more working class, a more Sinophone community. And so I wonder about the ethnic boundaries within the Chinese community in the Philippines. So like is there a more assimilated, relatively more assimilated position versus one that's less so, and how that might complicate this story of Chinese anti-communism? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
No extra points for you.
No extra points.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jack, and I'm in your HY101E this semester.
My HY101E.
Yeah, just a quick question. I just wonder if you can share with us more about how your current book speaks to your next book project that you are working on. Because I know that you're going to talk about language, the PRC, and the ROC. So I wonder if you can share more with us tonight. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me get to Lanxin's question. Lanxin's question was it about religion and ceremonies? And so I've been asked about the place of religion in my research before by Jack, and my answer is that it's not really something that they choose to play out, except rhetorically in their denunciations of communism as sort of this materialist, ideology. There's a surprising absence, enough, and again I think Joshua is doing research on this. There's a surprising absence of sort of Christian inflected anti-communist views among prominent members of the Chinese community. Again, the leading Chinese anti-communists, again, did not evince any sort of strong religious sensibilities. I don't think religion necessarily factored into how they understood their opposition to communism. But the ritualistic aspects of anti-communism are definitely there, right? Anti-communism in the Philippines during this period is very ritualistic, right? It involves visiting Taiwan, paying one's respects to Chiang Kai-shek, right? Visiting Jinmen, posing for group photographs with prominent ROC leaders, right? It involves staging anti-communist performances, right? In the course of establishing outward branches of the anti-communist league across the archipelago. Right? So there is a very ritualistic aspect to anti-communism. Ethnic boundaries, right? So the community, again, you're right. To the extent that I can tell, the persons who are most vocal about pushing anti-communism tend to be more recent migrants from China, as opposed to those who are second generation migrants, right? So it's the Singkek, right? The Filipino community Singkek who are the most vocal about promoting anti-communism. Right? But that isn't to say that mestizos and mestizas aren't capable of participating as well, right? One of the persons in my book, one of the persons I talk about in my book is a young woman of mestiza heritage, who is mestiza, who sort of freelances as an anti-communist and gets the Philippine military intelligence to employ her as a secret agent, right? And in doing so, she engages in what Caroline Howe calls the politics of strategic hybridity, which is to say that mestizos and mestizas are capable of exaggerating, accentuating their Chineseness when the need calls for it, when there are opportunities when there are opportunities there, right? In this case, working for the Philippine military intelligence. She does a terrible job of being a secret agent, though. And she never actually manages to identify any real communists.
The last question about your next project.
My book, yes.
To go into your tenure dossier, your department.
Yeah, so I'm working on a history of cultural relations between Singapore, China, and Taiwan, right? Centered on Singapore, right? History of cultural relations between these three nodes within the Sinophone world from the late 1970s to the end of the 1980s. So I'm interested in how we might understand language reform in Singapore, Chinese language reform in Singapore in a comparative perspective. After all three states in question were engaged in Mandarinization. Right? All three states in question, or two of the states in question, China and Singapore, were engaged in pushing, for example, character simplification. So how do we understand these transformations in sort of a transnational, transregional, and comparative context? And how do we understand the Chinese identity formation in Singapore, right? Beyond the confines of national history, beyond simply the impact of state policy onto Chinese society in Singapore, right? A narrative that gets repeated a lot, but which I'm eager to go beyond.
All right, and with that, no more further questions. Thank you very much for being a great audience. Thanks very much. The program says that there are some more refreshments.
Sorry, we've run out for the first.
Right, so people are exhausted with the refreshments. But I think that's a good sign, as said earlier by Almi. It's because of such great attendance. Thanks very much for being here this evening. If you want to thank him.
Thank you so much for coming. Right, I know that you all have a lot on your plates.